The storylines that came out of that day are just endless.
This will be a special day at Daytona, as the President of the United States will be here a little bit later.
I had covered Reagan at that point for 2 years. I ended up covering him for 6, and it's one of the few days in those 6 years that really stands out.
They will come across the yellow line.
I just watched Richard Petty win his 200th race.
My whole body was like shaking. I actually think my heart stopped at one point.
It was one of those goosebump moments. So you could not have created that.
It was a perfect day. It was made for a movie.
Saw Dad standing there with the President of the United States, and it was like, oh gosh.
The whole day, it was just beyond imagination.
July 4th, 1984 began as a typical Independence Day in Daytona Beach, Florida, a place where the national holiday and NASCAR racing have intertwined since 1959.
It's a sunny Independence Day in Daytona Beach, Florida, and the Grand National Stock Car Racing crowd has come back to the Daytona International Speedway for one of the sport's most important events, the Firecracker 400. Hello, I'm Jim Lampley. This race marks in each year the midway point of the Grand National Stock Car Racing season, and of course, being held here on the circuit's most fabled and prestigious speedway, Daytona, it is one that every driver wants to win. Working with me as our expert commentator, as he does in all forms of automobile racing, is Sam Posey. Sam, potential for a piece of history today.
Yeah, it certainly is, Jim. The piece of history you referred to is the possibility that Richard Petty, who has won 199 Grand National Stock Car races, will actually win his 200th today.
1984, I wasn't the sharpest I'd ever been as far as being a driver, but I think I was still competitive enough that we could win races, and from the standpoint of, you know, the age and all that kind of stuff, I wasn't on the downhill deal yet. I was just sort of holding my own with the situation that we had.
He was not running up front as much then as he had been earlier in his career, but I think he had already been established as the king because of the number of wins that he had, the number of championships, the number of Daytona 500 victories. He was already the king at that time.
Key in Richard's domination over the years was Dale Inman and the crew that they had. Richard was a pretty good engineer about what he wanted in a race car. And if he could communicate it to Dale Inman could get it done from the crew, whether it was springs, shocks, sway bars, motors, whatever. If Richard told Dale Inman, this is what I need in this race car, somehow or another it got done.
In 1981, veteran crew chief Dale Inman left Petty Enterprises as Richard and his brother Maurice struggled to maintain the team's past success.
A resurgent Richard Petty is rolling to the line. He is going to win. He's done it. He's won number 198 in his search for 200 career wins.
This puts you within 2 wins of 200. Thought about that?
Well, that's better. 198 is better than 197.
There was a remarkable postscript to the 24th annual Miller High Life 500. You're looking at the scene 4.5 hours after the event was completed in the press box at the Charlotte Motor Speedway. Just moments ago, Bill Gazaway of NASCAR made this announcement. Richard Petty's motor was found to be some 24 cubic inches over the limit. And at the end of the race, left side tires all the way around. That's a big no-no. The penalty, $35,000 fine, a 104-point disallowance. But the win, number 198, stands.
That race signaled the end of an era at Petty Enterprises. With Richard's son Kyle now racing, everything had changed at NASCAR's oldest family race team.
I looked at the situation and felt like, okay, you know, we got enough money for one car here at Petty Enterprises, so let's leave Kyle at Petty Enterprises, and I might have a better chance of going out and doing an outside situation. And we looked around, talked to a bunch of people. Then we got with Mike Curb.
Mike Curb was a modern-day Renaissance man, a record producer with over 300 #1 hits and a NASCAR team owner. In 1983, he needed a #1 driver.
Bill France called me, and he said, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I've got a driver for you." I said, "Who?" He said, "Richard Petty." I said, "What? Richard Petty wants to drive my car?" He said, "Well, let's put it this way. He's going to drive for another team, and I've recommended your team." So I met with Richard, and he agreed to sign with us for 2 years.
He was really an absentee owner. He was busy doing his thing. He was just really interested in racing, liked racing, and liked to come to the races, but he didn't have time to really come and run a race operation. So the racing part was left pretty well up to us. You know, we got Buddy Parrott in and had a really good situation.
I thought we'd win 10 races and win a championship. That's the way I think. That's the way our team thought. We knew we had our best car. We knew we had our best driver. And we knew we had the best pit crew.
Petty's 199th win prompted serious talk about reaching the pinnacle, number 200.
At the beginning of the year, the number 200 was not really on our radar screen. It wasn't a deal when we got to go, you know, get this one, and that. Until we won the 199th one, then naturally the 200th one was really come on screen.
I don't think Richard cared about 200. He was wanting 210. But when we won the race at Dover, Delaware, things started heating up a little bit, and especially coming up to Daytona.
And that was the race we were bringing President Reagan to. I never dreamed we would win.
Good morning, everyone, from Daytona International Speedway. It is simply a magnificent, beautiful day here in sunny Florida, and today's Pepsi Firecracker 400 marks the start of the second half of the 1984 Winston Cup season. This will be a special day at Daytona, as the President of the United States will be here a little bit later.
I was very impressed that the President was just going to come to the racetrack. First sitting president that we had ever been fortunate enough to have at a Cup race.
Then I was running Atlanta International Raceway, as it was known back then, and on race day was just a race fan sitting in the grandstand. Luckily had seats close to the start-finish line. Most of the attention that day was focused on the fact that the President was going to attend at some point during the day. And, you know, in some regards, maybe some of us, that overshadowed the race itself.
In addition to his music empire and his NASCAR team, Mike Curb was in politics. And in the summer of 1984, Curb was the finance committee director for President Ronald Reagan's re-election campaign.
About 6 or 7 of us were talking about what he should do on the 4th of July, because he was running for re-election that year. And I suggested that because he loved motorsports, that he come down to Daytona. See, Reagan started his career announcing car races in Des Moines, Iowa. So I knew he liked racing, and I had traveled with him, and we had talked about it. So I called Bill France Jr. and said, "Bill, are you sitting down?" You know, and he said, "Mike, if you want to bring someone to the race, just tell." I said, "No, are you sitting down?" "You're right, there's someone I want to bring. His name is President Ronald Reagan." The next day, Bill France Jr. came up to Washington, D.C., and we started sitting with the Reagan staff and mapping it out. This would have been like about March of '84.
I was the deputy director of the Presidential Advance Office. That's the office that's responsible for putting on all the president's public activities. So as I used to say to people, it was everything from the Rose Garden and the Washington Hilton to the summits in Moscow and Geneva and everything in between. I remember in '84, I calculated I had traveled something like 354 days that year, because when he was campaigning, he might be doing 3 or 4 stops a day. The themes that had been developed for the election year had been sort of all-American things, in effect wrapping the president in the red, white, and blue. And, you know, the NASCAR constituency fit perfectly into what was then considered to be the so-called Reagan Democrats, which were people who had probably never voted Republican in their life before 1980 when they voted for Reagan because they were fed up with the way things were going. So this was described to us as really being the perfect crowd for Reagan's message. I don't remember the exact words, but in effect it was, make this good. This is something he wants to do.
The NASCAR stars of the day were keen on the idea too. In fact, Richard Petty already had a tie to this particular president.
I met him 3 or 4 times. I'd been to the White House a couple times because we'd been big into Republican politics in North Carolina. He was just a regular feller, okay? He'd sit here on the front porch and we'd just talk about whatever. I mean, to me, he was just a down-home guy.
President Reagan was a hero of mine anyway. You know, earlier I had won, I guess, the 82 500 and started my victory lane speech with I love Ronald Reagan.
Right, Ned, and I want to say I love Ronald Reagan.
I was just so pleased that he was coming, and that's another reason why I wanted to win the race.
It was both fun and exciting from the racing, but it was also huge from a patriotic aspect. In those days, the 400 was actually run on the day of the 4th. This was like in the middle of the week in 1984. It wasn't a weekend. It was a hard holiday of July the 4th.
It was no holiday in the NASCAR garage. Blistering heat, a sellout crowd, and tight security made it evident that this would not be an ordinary 4th of July.
The most unusual thing was that when we came to the racetrack that morning, we couldn't get in the garage area because everybody had to go through metal detector. That was the first shocker that, you know, we really didn't know all that was going to happen.
When the president comes in, it's almost sort of diabolically opposed to what the normal plans are, because now you're trying to change everything. So, you know, let's say we've got to bring a motorcade through. You're talking about 25, 27 car motorcade. It's got to be somewhere where there's a scrambled phone there, and the White House communications agency comes in and sets that up and makes sure that if, you know, the missiles were coming over from the Soviet Union, you know, the president's going to go somewhere, and that's that room that's set up there. There are a lot of things that just, frankly, got in the way of the way normally things were done. I mean, how many years had they already done this, and we were there to tell them how well this is going to change.
That particular morning, we had to leave extra early because the security was extra tight, and it took us like 2.5 hours to get through the tunnel because they had to search inside, outside, you know, everybody in the car before they let them in the infield.
And then I can remember thinking, wow, it would be like a storybook if you know, Daddy could win. It just seemed like a dream, a fairy tale, kind of.
What was at stake for Richard Petty and his team that morning, I remember watching those guys, and you could tell from the intensity that they were working on the car and just looking at the team, you knew something big was up as far as them wanting to win that race.
We got through inspection. We had our problems with that car, you know, getting through inspection with it, because it was a very, very nice piece. Trust me, we had our mind on one thing. That was the race.
It was just another day. You know, didn't think it was any more special than what the day before was. It was just another race day, and as far as being able to put it all together, winning the 200th race in front of the President of the United States on July the 4th. You know, I didn't daydream that far.
As the drivers and crews prepared for the start of the Firecracker 400, discussion of Richard Petty finally winning his 200th race began to gain momentum.
There was part of the industry that hoped it would happen. There was also, I think, chatter and speculation that maybe 199 was going to be it. Because Richard wasn't a spring chicken at that point. And there was a lot of tough competition, obviously, on the racetrack.
The biggest obstacle to Richard's success comes in the form of Cale Yarborough, a man who was on the pole position and who set a new record in qualifying for this race. It's worth noting that Cale has won both of the races this year that he started from pole position, so he is
going to be very tough. One of those two races, of course, the Daytona 500 on this circuit earlier this year.
In the 80s, Cale Yarborough had been the dominant driver at Daytona International Speedway.
Down to the inside, the move he loves. Here he comes up to the inside. It is Cale Yarborough taking first. Turn number 3, coming for 4.
Cale's back-to-back Daytona 500 victories further fueled an intense desire to win on this special day.
Cale Yarborough was just, they talk about how intense Dale Earnhardt was and guys that have come in the sport right now. But I don't think anybody ever matched Cale Yarborough's intensity for driving a race car. Determined to win doesn't even get close to how bad Cale wanted to win races.
It was just the way that I was brought up, I guess. I was born and raised on a farm, milked a cow in the morning, plowed a mule, and there wasn't any racing in my background growing up. But when I finally got there, I was determined that I was going to stay there. I wanted to lead every lap that we ran, and I did what I had to do to stay on top.
In the drivers' meeting, you know, they had talked about the president was coming and how we were supposed to act and all this kind of stuff. And then they said, okay, the president's not going to be here, but he's going to say, gentlemen, start your engines from Air Force One.
And I remember at first people thought, oh, God, we've never done that. I don't think. But the more they thought about it, and the more we convinced them, you know, listen, this will be really great. You know, it'll be great for press coverage. The networks will love it. And they loved it back at the White House when we called back and suggested it.
I was the chief White House correspondent for NBC News, and to put it simply, where he went, I went. And only a tight pool of reporters would go with the president on Air Force One, 2 wire service reporters, 1 print reporter, and 1 television reporter. And at that time, there were only 4 networks, NBC, ABC, CBS, and CNN, and we would rotate. Because it was a big deal, we were called up to the front of the plane to photograph the president, and it was pretty cool, the idea. Here's the president on the telephone on Air Force One starting a car race, then still over 1,000 miles away at Daytona.
Mr. President, it's Bill France Jr., the president of the Speedway. We're not going to hold up any longer. Let's start the engine, sir.
All right. Gentlemen, start your engines.
And with that command from the President of the United States, 42 engines come to life on pit road. We are just minutes away from the start of the Firecracker 400.
It's a big deal. I mean, the President of the United States flying around somewhere and comes down and say, okay, guys, you know, crank it up and get ready to go. So the President was getting a bunch of publicity, but Cup Racing was getting a bunch of publicity too, so good trade-off for us.
The fact that Richard was such a big Republican and the President, who was a Republican, coming to the event, this would be the event for him to win, his 200. If it could happen here, that would be the ultimate.
They're about ready to do it here at Daytona this morning. An air of excitement has been here all week long, qualifying a new record for Cale Yarborough. The President of the United States just gave the command for the drivers to fire engines a moment ago. And can you hold your breath for 400 miles? That's what the drivers say.
They take the green flag. They're going off on the last one. Yarborough holding his lead on the inside of the track. Earnhardt is staying right with him. There's a little bit of action as they mix it up in the rows behind them. But Cale Yarborough is off to a very smooth start. Back at Daytona, racing under the green flag, and now the 2 central characters have moved to the front of the stage. Cale Yarborough, the pole sitter, on the lead. Richard Petty chasing him in second place. After 20 years of racing together, they know each other about as well as they possibly can.
It was pretty obvious to everybody that was there that they had the 2 cars to beat. One of those 2 likely would go to victory lane unless there was an accident or a mechanical failure in the cars. The intensity between those 2 at that particular time was pretty high, I guess is the best way to put it.
One thing that is not routine is to see both Cale Yarborough and Richard Petty running so close to the front so early on. This means that both of them are feeling very racy. That could be bad news for the rest of the
The
deal.
early stages of the race were fairly uneventful as Petty and Yarborough stayed in contention. As the action on the track settled down, spectators found their attention drawn up toward the sky.
When you're covering a story, you're focused on the president. You're not all that focused on, I mean, you're focused on where you're going in the sense that, yes, it was a NASCAR race, and yes, there was a story, Reagan trying to reach out to NASCAR voters, but you're not focused on where you're going to land. And I'll never forget, we're on Air Force One. We're coming lower and lower on approach, and suddenly you can see the speedway off to the side, and you look like you're coming right down in the middle of a huge crowd. I felt like I was landing on the backstretch, and once you realized you weren't landing near the speedway, you were landing next to the speedway, it was cool. I mean, you know, you see a lot of cool things when you cover a president. To be landing that close to the speedway in the middle of a major race was pretty cool.
You know, the race was pretty good, but when it was obvious that the Air Force One was coming in, there was a couple of laps where the race was ignored more or less, and as everybody kind of watched, and you know, the buzz started when the first person saw it and just passed it along pretty quick. People stood up and cheered, and it was an exciting moment.
Yeah, I saw the plane. You know, we were in a place on the racetrack where I was able to look over there and see it. But I did see it with my own eyes, and I was really pumped about that.
I actually think my heart stopped at one point. You know, when that plane was landing, you know, just the thought that this could be happening.
Air Force One carrying President Ronald Reagan, hovering even now over the backstretch as the cars go by.
What none of us knew was that the lone car on the track at that point would be Richard Petty's car. And it was just perfect. It was beautiful.
That was a great picture. I mean, you know, we were on the backstretch all by ourselves. I got to talking to the guys that took the picture, and I think he worked for the paper down there, and he was just following the airplane in, okay, and he followed it in, just click, 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 and said he got back that evening, and he had a world-beaten photograph, so he got a lot of play out of that particular picture.
When Air Force One landed at the Daytona Beach Airport over there, I was probably as keyed up as everybody else was. It was just like turning on electricity throughout the crowd and even in the garage and the drivers and everything else.
This is a big moment here. Stock car racing, a sport tied to conservative political traditions. Probably safe to guess that the president enjoys the political support of most of the 100,000 or so here. They'll be anxious to greet him as he comes over to the track.
There were moments I used to call the goosebump moments. And I remember the motorcade came out basically behind the grandstand. But there were people who could look over and see it, you know, from all around there. And I just remember that was one of those moments. The ovation was just incredible. You know, people had seen him. They weren't paying attention to the race anymore. They were actually looking down and seeing him.
I just remember microphones and going off, and everybody had a headset. We're going to bring him up. We're going to bring him up. No, don't bring him that way. Code this, code that. It was just wow.
You know, we got upstairs, and again, there was another big ovation because people could see to the right and left, you know, through the grandstands. They could all see that he'd got in there. In fact, I remember he wore kind of a white coat that day, which made him easy to spot.
He was wearing a pretty loud sports jacket, and he usually wore very conservative clothes, and so to see him in this almost white sports jacket, which was totally appropriate for the event, it was a little unusual.
This is more than the president ever does. I mean, he's never in a place as long as he was there, you know, just sitting there watching a race. So, you know, everybody wants to stand there around him. You know, our job is, you might want to go sit down over here, and, you know, Mr. France, it's probably time to take a seat. Try to do it politely because the press guys are going, who are these guys? Get them out of the picture, you know. So everybody's calmed down, and, you know, it's a feeling, I guess, of satisfaction. And you look around and go, well, this is going as it was planned.
And now out on the track, the leaders for the moment are the two men who began the day as the focus of this story. Number 28, Cale Yarborough in the lead, trying to repeat the feat of earlier this year when he won the pole and then won the race for the Daytona 500, trying to do it again in the Firecracker 400. Right behind him, in car number 43, Richard Petty, trying today to win his 200th Grand National Stock Car race. They are the leaders at this moment. We're a little more than halfway through the Firecracker 400.
The middle of the race, I think they were filling each other out. Cale liked to lead a lot more than Richard did. or maybe Cale could lead and we couldn't. But we had a real good pit crew, and we had great pit stops all day.
The quick work of Petty's pit crew proved pivotal late in the race, propelling the 43 to the front of the pack.
Petty's, you can see, getting away first, but remember, his pit lies earlier on the track, so they're going to be very close together. You're going to see them. Petty does, however, have the better of the exchange of pits.
While Petty held on to the lead, MRN radio announcer Ned Jarrett prepared to interview the President of the United States to a live nationwide radio audience.
We had been schooled on where we would sit. We practiced it during the week. And so when they came to get me and said, okay, it's your turn, where I was supposed to sit, someone was sitting in that seat, and but there was a seat open, so I just took the seat that was open, and it was next to the President, and we just went right into it.
Well, for a special treat for all of us here at Daytona International Speedway, let's go to our own Ned Jarrett right now.
Thank you, Barney Hall. It's now a great pleasure and an honor to welcome President Ronald Reagan, who, as you know, was an athlete himself in college and has a keen interest in sports. So on behalf of the people on Motor Racing Network, the Daytona International Speedway, President Reagan, we welcome you.
Well, Ned, I'm pleased to be here. This is a real kick for me. At the same time, however, having been a sports announcer myself, I'm kind of glad that I didn't have to broadcast this, because I'm having so much trouble trying to sort out who's on first.
It was as easy as doing, and easier in some cases, people that I had interviewed that I had known for a long period of time, because that's how the man made you feel.
You know, one of the great things about Reagan was he almost seemed to feel like it was his job to make other people comfortable in his presence, you know, so they chatted a lot and everything.
I'm just marveling at you and your ability as they come off that upper turn way over there to pick out who they are and what position and all.
Well, see,
that's having lived down among them.
I'm sure that you're amazed by the speeds that you're seeing these cars run here today and the control the drivers have over them.
Yes, I am, and I've noticed one thing already. I've been here only a short time. I've noticed that if you're trying to look at the number on the car, you better look when they're down the track a ways. You're not going to see it when they go by here.
Richard Petty, of course, driving the car number 43. Here he comes now off of turn 4, the blue and red car. And I believe you have some special ties to the owner of that car.
Yes, and he's sitting right up here. Mike Kerr was out there, and shouldn't mention this on a holiday like this, partisanship, but we were kind of tied up in politics.
I wanted to be in the pits with my car, but then when I was told that they wouldn't let the president come into the pits till after the race, I think I was in the right place. And they obviously didn't need any of my pit calls, did they?
You know, if I were faced with the responsibility of broadcasting this, Ned, and with Petty out in front, I would just keep watching Mike Curb down here to find out whether he was in front yet.
His reaction tells the story.
Yes.
It certainly does. Well, he's everyone here. I think Petty has such a tremendous following that they've been waiting for him to win 200, but he has his hands full now as Yarborough continues to what we call in the sport reel him in, because he's gaining on him.
As I talked with President Reagan, and I said, well, you're a former sportscaster. Would you like to call a few laps?
Why don't you pick him up and call him down through the front straightaway?
Oh, wait a minute here.
He tried, and it didn't really work. He did a thing where he said, well, somebody's coming around the corner, and, well, somebody just passed somebody else.
Somebody just went past somebody right out here in front of us. I don't think that's informed anyone who's listening on radio very much about the race, but I thought they changed positions just as they went by.
They certainly did, and Cale Yarborough, who is running the car number 28, is gaining on Richard Petty right now, who is running out front. As we see going into turn 1, Cale Yarborough continues to gain on Richard Petty, so it looks like we'll have a shootout down near the end of this race between those two drivers. So we're going to throw it back upstairs again, Mr. President. It's been a real pleasure having you here with us today for this Pepsi Firecracker 400.
Well, it's a wonderful 4th of July for me, and I wish everybody a very happy 4th.
We know that you look forward to greeting the winner.
It was a very special moment that here's an old country boy from North Carolina that had an opportunity to sit beside of a president and talk to him for that long of a period of time. And I thought back, how many people important people around the world would love to have that much time with the President of the United States, and I had it.
As the closing laps of the Firecracker 400 approached, Richard Petty and Cale Yarborough battled back and forth for the lead.
The race really did get good at the end between Cale Yarborough and Richard Petty. And they were really going at it, swapping the lead back and forth, and didn't know who was going to win it.
There goes Petty, and there goes Yarborough with him. As they go down the back straight, it is Richard Petty now in turn 3 who has taken the lead. They'll come out of turn 4 and onto the front straight now with Petty in the lead, Yarborough in second place.
It came down to Cale was waiting for the last lap. Cale's just coming like gangbusters.
I'd raced with him all day, and I knew my car was a little bit better than his. I tested him a time or two, knew where I needed to be on that final lap. I had Richard set up right where I wanted him. I wanted that last lap slingshot. He knew what was coming. He knew what was going to happen.
So I was sitting there and I said, okay, I know basically what Cale's going to try to do, and then what can I do? I said, okay, I'm going to hoodwinkle him here. I'd run some pretty good laps and stuff, run wide open, and I said, okay, now this is the way I'm going to play this game. Every lap, I'd lean off a little bit, slowing the pace down. Well, Cale's back there busy running and not noticing that the pace was slowing down.
He was backing the race up. He was backing himself up so he would have something at the end.
We are building toward a dramatic finish. President Ronald Reagan looking on alongside Bill Branch Jr. It is Richard Petty in car 43, Cale Yarborough in car 28. Now as they try to position themselves for the last lap first to the finish.
I made a mistake in that race. My car was quick enough that I could have won the race instead of waiting for that last lap slingshot move.
We come down the front stretch with a couple laps to go, and here's a car way up in the air going in the first corner. And I said, oh, okay, this is going to be it.
And a car is spun out. Doug Hebron's car is spun out in turn 1. The yellow caution flag is going to come out.
We went right past the start-finish line before they threw the caution. So we knew whichever one was back first was going to win the race.
This will, in all intents and purposes, perhaps be the last lap of the race.
And then when the caution came out, then Cale realized that he better get on the deal. But that's when Richard surprised the heck out of him because he had something left.
Quick as I seen what was happening, I go wide open again, okay?
We were going into turn 1, and I was right on his bumper. I didn't have my right distance behind him to make the slingshot work. I got by him anyway, and I beat him into the third turn.
So then we go down the back stretch, and here he comes. He pulls out, goes by me, goes in that corner about 10 miles an hour faster than he'd been for the last 8 or 10 laps. And the car moves up. And when it did, then that gave me a chance to go back under him.
This may be the race that we're looking at here as they sweep up into traffic.
They are door to door in the dogleg. They touch, coming to the trial, down to the line.
Coming down the front straight. Here they are, Sam. They will come across the yellow line.
It's Richard Petty by a foot. Petty wins his 200th career NASCAR victory.
The race was over, technically, but it wasn't over. There was still some more time to go. That's when they would, of course, finish the race under caution if necessary, and it was necessary at that time.
It was not the checker flag, it was a caution flag. So we get in line, and the pace car comes out. Well, we make the lap and come around. Cale goes down pit road.
Now with 1 lap to go, and behind Petty, Cale Yarborough is turning off and heading toward pit road. No, Cale goes right through the pits and back out. I'm trying to think if there's any remaining element of strategy that could have dictated that move. I can't think of it.
He thought once they crossed that finish line and he beat me, well, I'm through.
I misread the flagman's fingers, and when we came down for the caution flag there, I thought the race was over. And I guess my brain blew up is what happened. It was just a dumb thing for me to do, and I came in, which lost some more positions. I always wished that I had that race to run over again, or that last lap to run over again. I think I'd have been a little bit harder to get by than I was.
We were warned that we needed to be prepared for the fact that when the winner comes up, This guy's going to be out of breath. You know, he could need an oxygen tank. I mean, you know, which none of us were really experienced with. So we were told, one is there might be a time gap. As I remember, there really wasn't a gap because Petty, if I recall right, got out of the car and just about ran to go up there.
And a sensational rendezvous with destiny for Richard Petty, who has political aspirations. He will now, not for the first time, be meeting President Reagan as part of the victory celebration.
Then we go up in the announcer's booth, and there's the president.
And now here in what for today has become the winner's circle, I am with the guest of honor, President Ronald Reagan, and the honored man of the day who has won his 200th Grand National Stock Car race, Richard Petty. Mr. President, it's great to have you here. A member of your staff intimated to me yesterday that although you are interested in the fortunes of all race drivers, you might be excited to see this occasion, Richard Petty winning his 200th. It's quite a day, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is. I understand that no one in the whole history of racing has ever done that or ever won 200 races.
I thought it was a fairly long interview. I remember Reagan kind of made fun of himself on how he sort of announced the race for a while.
And you called 4 or 5 laps on the radio. How'd you think your race call went?
Not very good. I'm glad that when I was a sports announcer, it was mainly baseball and football and a few things like swimming and that sort of thing, because I was having an awful lot of laps after I got here when I was trying to figure out who was where.
When you watch the Lampley interview, the thing that's striking is that Jim asks Petty more questions than he asked the president. And the president is kind of looking on as a bystander. Now, Ronald Reagan was not often the bystander, but that particular day he kind of was, and looking on with admiration at Richard Petty.
For the victory. Well, just as the one across the start-finish line. You know, you're going in one direction, then when you turn at the start-finish line, you look down into the first and second corner just as far as you can see. And
I think he really enjoyed just something different that he hadn't ever seen before up close. It basically blew the president's mind that we were running 200 mile an hour and leaving black marks on each one of his car.
You could tell Reagan was enjoying it. They were both very relaxed. They obviously were very comfortable with each other.
With all the presidents that's ever been in the United States, this is the first one that's ever showed up at a racetrack. So everybody's got to go from that, from racing standpoint, and I wanted to be the one that was able to welcome him to Grand National Racing.
Ronald Reagan and his team saw the NASCAR demographic as an important political constituency. He went after it that day, and my guess is he got a lot of votes.
I join in the congratulations. I even have a conflict of interest here because he's doing some yeoman service in a political sense.
What was really neat about it was we got the president on the sports page, but he got us on the front page. So it was a good trade-off.
While the president and the king chatted in the grandstands, the iconic number 43 was pushed into victory lane for the 200th time.
When we got through with the president up in the press box, then they went down and we went to the regular winner's circle deal. They had a big sign there, 200 win. Anytime you want to race with the kids and Linda at the racetrack, it was a big deal.
If Daddy won and we all were in there, he would always let like one of us hold the trophy, and I got to hold the trophy. In the picture, I'm the one standing there holding the trophy.
We were always right there when he would get out of a car if we were there, and he would always, you know, speak to Mama. She knew from the moment how big it was, more than us.
I think she was about 1.5 feet off the ground when we went in the winner's circle there because grins and stuff, and she just sort of floating around. I had to go then and clean up, take a bath, change clothes and stuff, because they said as quick as the race was over with, was going to have a picnic with the President of the United States.
My guess is that we decided it was going to be something sort of very ordinary American. Everything has to be planned. You're planning where he's going to sit and who he's going to sit with, and then you've got White House stewards that have to come in and supervise where the food came from, the preparation and the serving and things like that.
And they all brought us some chicken. Okay, so we had a chicken dinner. I think Bobby was on one side of the president, and I was on the other side of the president.
He was a hero of mine, and I was just so pleased to be around him, to be there by him. Just listen to every word he said.
There were times like that when he actually although he was still in public, he could really relax.
Reagan was a performer, and whether he was laid back or not, he knew what his role was to play there. And, you know, he was going to be amongst all the good old boys. He was going to be a good old boy.
When he said something about, well, you know, I'm in a little race of my own this year.
I know how you all feel, too, because I'm in a little race myself this year.
It was a non-political event, but I think he had to make an allusion to the campaign somehow. It was a great coincidence that they had Tammy Wynette, and when we found that out, I mean, I guess it was fairly obvious, but the first thing we said was, could you sing Stand By Your Man when the president's here, because obviously the allusion to the re-election.
Tammy Wynette was obviously a great showwoman, and so was Ronald Reagan. And they were two performers on the stage and thoroughly enjoying the spotlight together. Not only was the president standing beside her, but they ended up arm in arm, head to head, and that was pretty unusual. Ronald Reagan didn't do that with just anybody.
Kind of like you want to high-five somebody, you know? It's like when something like that happened. We would judge our success in a lot of ways in those days, but primarily it was by television coverage. So that brief clip, in this case, I think Chris Wallace's clip on NBC was probably the best we could hope for.
This is NBC Nightly News, reported by Tom Brokaw.
Good evening, and it was a very active 4th of July for President Reagan. He started a stock car race. He warned Jesse Jackson about interfering in foreign affairs, and he said that while he's not happy with rising interest rates, he has no plans for government action to control them. Chris Wallace reports tonight that it was all in a day's work for a man running for re-election.
Despite the obvious campaign benefits today, the president's trip here was paid for by the taxpayer. A spokesman explaining that Mr. Reagan did not ask for any votes. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the president in Florida. At a certain point, the NASCAR dads became an identifiable demographic that politicians went after. Long before anybody else saw it, Ronald Reagan and his team saw the NASCAR demographic as an important political constituency. He went after it that day, and my guess is he got a lot of votes.
What people saw was Ronald Reagan among NASCAR fans, among 100,000 people, ordinary Americans, sitting there having Kentucky Fried Chicken with Richard Petty and other drivers and real people. It really couldn't get much better than that.
It was an unusual event on a lot of levels. I had covered Reagan at that point for 2 years. I ended up covering him for 6, and it's one of the few days in those 6 years that really stands out.
To have the president there and for Richard to achieve not only his 200th win, but that was his last win. So what does that tell you? You know, maybe we should have gotten the president to come more races, you know?
When I look back and think about it, I guess the biggest thrill that day was coming to the flag and looking over and thinking I beat Cale. Forgetting the President of the United States, forgetting all the happiness stuff. Hey, we just won another race. But it was a big deal to be up there with the President of the United States on July the 4th, win your 200th race. It was just beyond imagination, I guess.